2. Hello, friends, and welcome to another edition of Dan and Benny in the Ring. I'm Dan Sebastiano, joined as always by the BS Express himself, Benny Scala. Benny, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I have a couple of quick shout-outs. So yesterday was my brother Jim and his beautiful wife Sue's 40th wedding anniversary, so I just want to say kudos to them. Today is my nephew Jonathan Nelson, a.k.a. Jables, 28th birthday. Now, Jonathan kicked my ass in an eating contest 4 years ago, so I am hell-bent to get my revenge. You know, Dominic DeNucci's avoiding me, but Jonathan won't. So, and then now I think there's somebody else that has a birthday tomorrow, if my memory is correct. Who would that be, man?
Your memory is correct, Benny. That would be me. I was hoping we could get around that. One year closer to reaching that grizzled old veteran status that you have, Benny.
Okay, well, I'm there.
You know, actually, before we get to our panel, you talk about shout-outs. The average sports entertainment, that's wrestling, UFC, football, baseball, basketball, anything sports entertainment, the average life of a sports entertainment podcast is, according to the Podbay and Podbean records, is 3 episodes. This is actually episode number 30 for us. So 10 times the exceeded length of the average podcast, and we continue to grow. And we do so because of not just the fans, but because we can constantly put out the good content, and we can't do that without good guests and good panelists. So to get to the crew we have today, we're joined by a friend of the show. He is a award-winning filmmaker, angry wrestling fan, and a growing YouTube personality, Mike Messier. Mike, how you doing, buddy?
Well, I've got this special shirt for your birthday, Dan, that I'll send to you. This it hasn't quite reached the salvage bin for the Salvation Army in my neighborhood. I've kept.
You might need to go there, though. No.
Yeah, well, but anyway, Dan, happy birthday, buddy! Congratulations.
Well, I appreciate it. For those that without the video, Mikey just held up one of the old Wrestling with the Future shirts. That was the show Benny and I met on before we spun off and did our own thing. But joining Benny, Mikey, and myself is another friend of the program. He's an author at ProWrestlingStories.com, formerly senior editor for the GorillaPosition.com. He's currently writing a series, which I recommend, on the old wrestling territories. We're recording this on a Tuesday. The bit about the AWA just uploaded this morning. Jim Phillips. Jim, thanks for joining us, man. How you doing?
How you doing today, my brothers? And how we doing from the Rocky Mountain? Big hello from Denver.
There you go.
All right.
Got Florida, a couple of guys in Florida, Virginia, and Colorado. Good stuff. Well, we're going to take a little different approach. Benny and I, we've done the past. We've talked about, obviously, one of our taglines, celebrating wrestling's storied past. One of the bits we do in the present, though, is pay-per-view reviews and talk about things. Mikey, I know we've had many conversations about the current wrestling product. But something we had talked about doing for a long time and never really got to was a classic pay-per-view review, something where we could get some old fans together and kind of talk about an older show. And for reasons that I'm not 100% sure, Benny thought the first pay-per-view we should do, and Benny, I'm throwing you completely under the bus, this was entirely your idea to make us sit through this spectacle, was the 1991 Great American Bash. Now, this show has an interesting build-up to it because it was pitched, and before we get to the review, it's important to put a little backstory. The main event was supposed to be a cage match, Legend versus Legacy, as they called it. Ric Flair defending the WCW title against Lex Luger. Now, WCW title is important because this is the first Great American Bash pay-per-view under the WCW banner, no longer the NWA. Now, prior to this show, Ric Flair had some disagreements with Jim Herd, who was notoriously easy to work with, especially during his time running WCW. And he was, depending on which story you believe, he was unceremoniously let go, taking the belt with him, the big gold championship belt, because he had paid the down payment on it. So he wanted that money back, plus interest for all the time he had had the belt. Jim Herd told him pound sand. So Ric Flair took the belt and went home and left. And famously brought the belt with him when he signed with the WWF. Remember the segments with Bobby Heenan calling Ric Flair the real world champion, holding the belt up, the thinly veiled attempts to not quite say NWA, WCW. But so you had one of the biggest shows of the year. Great American Bash was one of NWA's biggest and WCW's biggest pay-per-views of the year. And you had to change the main event at the last second. And we'll get to that as we progress. Another story that'll come up. But so this show started really as a cluster and really did not get any better from there. So, Mikey, this is your old stomping grounds. Some of the shows. This took place July 14th, 1991, from the Baltimore Arena in Baltimore, Maryland. Anybody that knows anything about NWA wrestling, Jim, tell me if I'm wrong here. Baltimore was always a hot crowd for the NWA.
Yes, sir.
And this crowd was ready for a good show, and based on the crowd reactions, they did not go home happy at all. So, Benny, what do you think? You regretting picking this one, or you think we can still have fun with it?
Well, I think the tire marks on my back are the same as on my cousin Vinny. Was the 1963 Pontiac Tempest of some brand of Firestone, but it's okay. I think we'll enjoy this actually.
No, let's be honest, guys. Half the fun of nostalgia is going back, and we all did it, going back and watching stuff you remember and being like, holy crap. And I Jim, you said it. Benny, you said it. Mikey, I'm sure you had the same thought when we rewatched it. This is worse than I remember.
Actually, I want to disagree a little bit, Dan, if I could. For those that don't know, I'm kind of an ageless individual. I don't really age like most human beings. So I was actually in attendance at the 1988 Great American Bash, the Luger Flair pay-per-view, as a young child with a great memory. The next year, the 89 Bash, which everybody universally loves, Flair Funk, I was there for that. The next one, 1990, I was not in attendance, but I watched on pay-per-view. And this would be the one after that. So this would be the fourth Baltimore Bash pay-per-view. The Bash started in 85, before there was pay-per-view wrestling, really. So this kind of hits me in the system. And like yourself, Dan, I really did criticize this show quite a bit. And I remember watching it in college, years after it took place initially on VHS tape, because I still had my VHS copy, and besmirching it and laughing at the scaffold match in particular, and thinking the fans chanting, "We want Flair, we want Flair." Like, that's one of the first. I mean, if you take a look at Lesnar versus Goldberg at WrestleMania 20, tell me how the fans in Baltimore chanting, we want Flair, we want Flair, weren't the predecessor to those fans booing Goldberg and Lesnar out of the building in Madison Square Garden. Tell me how the Luger Windham double face heel turn, Luger turning heel in the main event, Windham de facto turning babyface. Tell me how Steve Austin, Bret Hart didn't take a page out of that at WrestleMania 13 that we all praise. And the undercard of this show at the time was very Jim Hurdish, very jokey. You had, 7-foot tall Kevin Nash, who wasn't in the physical condition he would be in as Diesel, but there's Nash in this Oz outfit. There's a pretty good match, actually. The Z-Man, Tom Zank, against Razor Ramon as the Diamond Stud, as Scott Hall was known. But some of these matches were actually pretty good matches if you stripped away the gimmicks. What I watched this show again about 2 or 3 weeks ago when Benny invited me on this show, and I'm watching this thing. I'm like, man, this isn't so bad. What's bad about this show is the sizzle on top of the steak. The steak has got a lot of potential. You've got a lot of guys on this show. Ron Simmons versus Kevin Nash. That's a great match on paper if it's not Ron Simmons versus Oz. Tom Zank versus Scott Hall is a pretty good match if it's not Diamond Stud against Tom Zank. Z-Man. Johnny B. Bad versus Flying Brian. They had a great match a couple of years later at Fall Brawl 95. At this point, with Flying Brian under the hood, which was really a defunct angle because he's feuding with Barry Windham, but now Barry Windham's turning babyface later on in the show. That's a dead gimmick for Brian Pillman, and he's facing Johnny B. Bad, who who really was coming out of the preliminaries. Like Johnny B. Bad was a preliminary guy that Dusty liked and gave a gimmick to him, but he was really a personification of on-the-job training. I'm talking about Martin Mero.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, we'll get to you jumping ahead a bit there,
I'm getting
Mike.
hot, I'm getting hot.
We'll get to the matches.
You know, it's really funny though. Mike said exactly the same thing that he said it in so many words. I said, you know, before we started that there was a lot of great ingredients, but maybe the chef wasn't on board.
Right. And I'll admit, even for all the and trust me, I've got a lot more negative to say. This was not one night, you know, what was it? December to Dismember, or some of those shows that are just absolute garbage start to finish. This had moments that were entertaining. They just got completely drowned out by the crap. I've used the analysis before on the show. There's a term in nature called reharvesting. It's certain creatures survive off the sustenance from larger creatures like bugs that eat through bear poop and whatnot. And because, you know, larger animals don't digest everything. And I've always said shows like this, it's reharvesting. There's little nuggets of goodness, but to get through it, you got to go through a lot of shit. And that's the best way I could think to describe this show. And we'll get to that. Now, interestingly enough, something that gets missed a lot is before the show started, there was a dark match where the Junkyard Dog defeated Black Bart. And apparently, I haven't been able to find video of that match, but apparently the from what I've read, it was well received by the crowd and was entertaining. This was 91. Junkyard Dog was on a down slope from his career, but earlier the year he had won when WCW had the 6-man tag titles. So he was, I don't remember off the top of my head if he was still champion at the time, but he had gold only a few months before the show. So I mean, it wasn't by any means a veteran being thrown out. But Benny, you mentioned it, the scaffold match, and that was the opening of the show. You had PN News and Bobby Eaton against Steve Austin and Terrence Taylor. I almost said Terrence Taylor. Now this is the match, Benny. When we were talking about the show, I said that one, there's never in my life have I seen a scaffold match that's truly entertained me. There's been moments. Obviously ECW had a couple, and for example, the big tumble that say Jim Cornette took. You know, there are some moments, but there's very few times you point, and really never you point at a scaffold match and go, hey, this match was amazing. And I mean, this match had Bobby Eaton, Steve Austin, and Terrence Taylor, three of the best technical performers of their generations. Some would argue some of the better technical performers in the history of wrestling, and it was garbage. So, Jim, I'm going to bounce it to you first. You've got the flag stipulation. You got to walk across, grab the flag, walk back across. What were you thinking watching this kind of talent that's just wasted on, as Mikey said, just a crap gimmick because it was so narrow? They were clearly more interested in not dying than they were in putting on a good match. What were your thoughts here?
It was just so slow and just trudged along, and then obviously you really couldn't do the fast-paced match because they're up off the ground like that. But I felt really bad for Bobby Eaton more than anybody else in that whole scenario. Just everything that he had went through coming up into that, getting split off from the Midnight, and now he's getting shuffled around from these teams. And the PN News, you were just waiting for a catastrophe with him up on the scaffold. I never really understood why you would start a pay-per-view with that match anyway. It just seems crazy to me. And they did the same thing the following pay-per-view when they had the Chamber of Horrors. I don't mean to jump on you guys, but they did the same thing there. They started the match with started the pay-per-view with the big, you know what I mean, the over-the-top match. It just doesn't make any sense. It was didn't make any sense to me at all. I was shaking my head through the whole thing. And the match itself was ugly. You know, there's not too much to be redeemed there. Even with the three, like you say, the three great workers that were involved, you know what I mean, there's only so much to be done.
Absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned Halloween Havoc with the Chamber of Horrors match, because that match did the same thing this one did. It really killed the crowd for a good chunk of the show. When you start with a boring, awful match, especially, I mean, this is Baltimore NWA crowd. They want good wrestling, and you start with this. They know you just wasted 3 good talents and PN News. So it's a bad start. Benny, what do you think?
I made some observations when I watched it. I guess one is, when you every once in a while when you go for a job, you have to take that aptitude test, and one of the questions is which of these doesn't belong. And you got Stunning Steve Austin, Terrence Taylor, Bobby Eaton, and then PN News. So that's a pretty easy answer. I guess one of my questions is why wasn't Alexandra York out there with Terrence Taylor, number one, and because he was part of the foundation by then, I believe.
Yeah, it's where the Terrence name came from.
Yeah. So and the other comment is, so Stunning Steve was out there with Lady Blossom, and one of the things, even though Alexandra York was not there, one of my observations with watching this whole pay-per-view was the proliferation of managers. I couldn't believe how many there were.
Yeah, actually, that's a note we'll get to in a bit. But you did not have the excuse me. You basically had the entire night was managers. The 5th match of the evening, the 4th on the card, was you mentioned Alexandra York when she first came out, but really it was not until, I kid you not, the 9th match of the evening, Nikita Koloff against Sting, that you had an empty ringside. You had 12 matches on the card, and 10 of them, well, it's technically 10 of them, Paulie Dangerously wrestling as the manager position with managers. I mean, I'm all for bringing managers back. I think they can add to it, but you can also, like you said, you can drown in it. But Benny, Mikey, you seem to have some thoughts here. What were your thoughts on the scaffold match?
Well, my thoughts on the scaffold match, again, at the time watching it, it was absurd, ridiculous. It seems like they could have had a passable standard match. I think the problem is, and to give him some credit, PN News actually walks out to about, he does walk the length of the scaffold at 450 pounds or whatever he was. So
he said no fear height.
Yeah, I mean, the wooden floor for the scaffold. I think what this show reminds me of, guys, is a lot of modern era WWE stuff where the talent is trying. That's one thing I'll say about most wrestling that I've ever seen, whether it's WWE, WCW, ECW, the modern stuff. It seems like the wrestlers, for the most part, always really, really, really try. And what was the failure on this show, again, is Jim Herd was like a non-wrestling guy. He had a slice of experience with wrestling, but it's almost like you can just really see the roadmap of maybe a casual wrestling fan who's giving you a comic book version of what wrestling should be from a casual wrestling fan's perspective.
Right.
Like you guys, I never thought about this manager thing before, but it's like a guy who's sort of a wrestling fan. He thinks, oh, Bobby the Brain Heenan or J.J. Dillon. Okay, there needs to be a manager for every match. Okay, we've got some gimmicks on the wrestling, like a Jimmy Boogie Woogie Man Valiant versus the Assassin is maybe a gimmick match he had seen, and he takes that to the next level. Well, this guy has to be the Oz guy because we want to make Ted Turner happy with the Wizard of Oz movie, and these have to be the computer lady stable of the York Foundation. So everything is just kind of broad stroked, meaning that everything's an exaggeration. And Dan, you made a good point. This is Baltimore. I was there for the '88 Bash, which was really the farewell, the swan song of the Horsemen. The '88 Bash is the obituary of the golden era Horsemen. Windham with a U.S. belt, Flair with the world title, Tully and Arn. Well, we're 3 years removed from that. People were still expecting to see Rick and Luger in the cage. Instead, everything's changed. I guess my feeling, if you want to know my feeling, the scaffold match, it sucked. But I do feel like there was some earnest attempt. But also, I'm kind of glad these guys didn't do much more, because imagine if Stone Cold had fallen from that thing. We never would have had Austin 316, 6 or 7 years later. So although the match itself stunk, it's better that it stunk and they were safe rather than anyone breaking their leg or their neck.
Yeah, no,
they just looked terrified. I mean, that was my one observation. They just, the whole onus, the whole focus of that match was them not trying to fall, which I don't blame them. I would do the exact same thing. I don't want to, that would be a pretty nasty fall.
Yeah, and it was again, it was kind of crappy. I question one thing about it before we move on to the next match is the ending. I almost feel like Bobby Eaton just kind of went into business for himself, because if you notice, the bell ringing and him grabbing the flag doesn't quite line up. It's almost like he said, "I'm done. Let's get out of here," and that was it. And really, the whole
hairspray thing happened after supposedly the match was
exactly
over.
what I was about to get to. Then the hairspray comes in, which should have been the ending. I really think that Eaton, at least leading the charge, was kind of like, "Guys, we're done," and he just walked off. But the follow up, however, the second match on the card, and something Mikey alluded to, was actually a decent match. The Diamond Stud, Scott Hall, who had debuted previously at the previous pay-per-view, he had debuted at Super Brawl with his manager Diamond Dallas Page, another manager, defeating Tom Zank, the Z-Man. Now, this was, Mikey, I'm going to give you this one because we really there's really not much to go on other than the fact that this was a good passable match. But this was kind of one of the highlights. What do you think?
I think it was a highlight because I think Scott Hall, and guess what? As a wrestling fan at the time, a pretty smart wrestling fan at a young age, I didn't put two and two together that the Diamond Stud was Scott Hall until he became Razor Ramon a year or so later in the WWF, and that's when all the things came together. You know what I mean? Because he did a heck of a job, and the story is that Diamond Dallas Page greased Scott Hall's hair back and brought Diamond Stud, the new presentation of Scott Hall, over to Dusty, and they fooled him because they didn't realize that this was the same guy as Scott Hall, who was an overjobber 2 years earlier. Like if you go back to 1989, Scott Hall is in the Great American Bash of the 2-ring Battle Royal. It made no sense that Scott Hall, who was so full of promise in the AWA, was suddenly a jobber in 1989 WCW, but there he is, losing matches to Terry Funk on Saturday morning. Anyway, this match was good. The Z-Man, he passed away, I think 7 or 8 years ago, Tom Zank, but he had a really pretty damn good run in WCW as a lower mid-card, upper mid-card babyface. He kind of floated in those three positions. Zank had some great tag team matches with Flying Brian. They were U.S. tag team champions. He actually had a great junior heavyweight match with Flying Brian. I guess for me, guys, I always look at this type of era, even the Jim Herd era of WCW, with nostalgia. This was really like a time when I was cementing myself as an NWA fan. Or WCW fan, or both. I saw Ric Flair going over to the WWF and winning the title there as like a victory for the NWA and WCW. You know what I mean? That's how demented I was about this whole thing. So I like this match. To answer your question, it's interesting that you talk about the manager thing. I mean, it was almost like Humperdinck and DDP were like co-managers of the Freebirds, and then they had the Diamond Stud. It's like you had one stable with two managers. They called Humperdinck like the road boss or something. So anyway, it was a good, solid match. The stuff before the match of the women pulling off the Diamond Stud's, chaps.
Yeah, his tearaway pants.
Right. But it was fun. I mean, it was a good, solid, quick match. I liked it.
I didn't know that the toothpick started back with the Diamond Stud. I had no idea until I watched the pay-per-view.
That whole gimmick is the whole Razor Ramon gimmick is the Diamond Stud in different clothes. Yeah. You change the outfit, it's the same gimmick. But like he was mentioning they couldn't do nothing with him with Scott Hall when he came from the AWA. He was this big muscle-bound baby face, and they had nothing to do with the guy. They put that Gator gimmick on him, Scott Gator Hall, and shot those vignettes of him stomping around in a swamp. And then, like you say, 2 or 3 months later, here he is back as the Diamond Stud with the gimmick that's going to cement his career,
Jim nailed it on the head. The Razor Ramon was the Diamond Stud after he moved to Florida. I mean, go ahead, Benny.
No, like after he moved to Miami and just acquired a really
Right?
crappy accent.
Yeah, the Diamond Stud got recruited by Scarface, but something else to before we move on, I think it's important to note because he doesn't really get a lot of credit, like you said, Benny. Is Tom Zank was kind of the Sean Waltman of his generation in that they put him in the matches that they needed to look good. He was the one who wrestled what did they call him, the Phantom when Rick Rude went back to WCW in 91, 92. He was Ricky Steamboat, the Freebirds, the Midnight Express. Whenever you needed a good match that you could have somebody that would lose and everybody still look like $1 million, Zank was the one that did that. I think he doesn't get enough credit for really being as good, and I don't even want to call him an enhancement talent because he had a run with Gold and some high profile matches, but he was just the kind of guy that enhanced everybody he was in the ring with. And
I enjoyed the Z-Hose that he came out with.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mikey.
There was a lot of stuff on this show, guys, that I didn't remember. As I've watched this show more than once. I watched it live as it happened on pay-per-view, and I watched it a few other times on tape. It's almost like Mandela effect moments. When you get to the Elegante match, I'll get into more of that. But yeah, Zank coming out with the women, and it's like I said, guys, it really did seem like with all this flourish, all this sizzle, how can you afford to hire these models and these other accoutrement people, and you can't keep your Ric Flair on the paycheck?
Thank you for saying that.
You know what I mean? So anyway, but yeah, Zank was a quality wrestler. I think he was just a solid mid-card babyface, and good for you, Dan, for putting him over because he was a solid wrestler, and he was also one of the earliest internet wrestlers, like one of the wrestlers who first had like a website or a forum and was talking trash about the business. So Zank and like Honky Tonk Man were some of the first guys to do that type of thing.
Absolutely. And moving from good talent in a good place to good talent in a bad place, the next match was Ron Simmons against Oz. Now, I mean, I honestly think we could spend the rest of the show just talking about how bad the Oz gimmick was, and we still wouldn't scratch the surface of how bad the Oz gimmick was. So, I mean, you have Kevin Nash, who had just recently been Vinny Vegas, or excuse me, he became Vinny Vegas. He was the
Master Blaster.
Thank you, Master Blaster. You had this big muscular talent coming out in the green robe with the fake beard, accompanied by the Wizard, who was Kevin Sullivan in a really terrible mask with a monkey that on his shoulder that didn't want to cooperate. Monkey went into business for himself. But you had the really terrible costumes for the Wizard of Oz extras, and I mean something I didn't catch until I rewatched it. Maybe it's the HDTV, maybe not. But when he scared off the Wizard of Oz cast and they ran off, when the actor dressed like the Tin Man turned around, you could see that it was like 3/4 of a costume, kind of like those ones you get at the Party City where it was just tied in the back and you could see the shirt and stuff he was wearing underneath. Like, it was awful. But this whole gimmick is terrible. This intro is terrible. But Ron Simmons did again. Mikey, you talk about doing what you can to salvage the match. We've each taken a turn. Jim, you drew the short straw on this one. You get to be the first to talk about this match.
Well, thankfully that they didn't have Ron Simmons go under to such a horrible gimmick. As I was rewatching the match, as it started, I was thinking to myself, my God, I can't believe they're going to put Oz over on Ron Simmons, which, yeah, that would have been horrible for me. I did not realize, and I just now learned, that was Kevin Sullivan in that horrible costume. That it looked like that little guy off that He-Man movie, which was also a piece of crap. It was terrible all the way around. You had the big backdrop, the fabric backdrop of the Oz castle and all that. It was bad news all the way around. I felt bad for Ron Simmons.
Jim, I'll tell you what, you're a friend of the show, and you're definitely a contributor on our page, and I love your articles, but I swear if I ever hear you say anything bad about Gwildor again, I will personally come to Colorado and hurt you. He was the highlight of that movie.
Oh my Lord. Well, to say that that's a highlight of that movie, I guess that's like saying he's the biggest fly on the shit pile.
To be talking no smack about Dolph Lundgren as He-Man, that was my hero. But no, this match again, you said it right. It was the proper outcome, and this goes to what Benny and I had talked about earlier with the Baltimore crowd. The crowd just absolutely crapped all over everything when the Oz gimmick started, when the intro started. Poor Kevin Nash could not salvage it. Not even his amazingly well and clearly not spray painted gray hair. This was just bad start to finish. Benny, what do you think?
Well, I did notice that Kevin Sullivan didn't really do much of anything as the Wizard. And I think the one time he did interfere, you could see his sweatpants under his robe. And that was pretty much the highlight of the match for me. But now I have a question. Was this his last match as Oz? And did he go right from Oz to Vinny Vegas right after this?
I think it was. I think he only wrestled 3 times on television as Oz, if I'm not mistaken. I think 2 clashes in this pay-per-view, or maybe a clash in 2 pay-per-views, something like that. I think he only did 3 shots as Oz.
Yeah.
If I could say something, though.
Go ahead, Mike.
Devil's advocate to defend maybe just big picture stuff, trying to be positive here, positive page, right? Look, we all mock and ridicule Oz, but it's kind of like Triple H doing the 1-minute job to Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 12. Some of these guys who endured stuff like that, namely Triple H, and in this case Kevin Nash, because they know what they don't want to do in wrestling, because they've had to do it. Like they've had to go out there and, in Triple H's case, put Ultimate Warrior over in 63 seconds. And Kevin Nash's case, put on this ridiculous green mask and a hood and a crown, and you're Oz, right? Because they know what doesn't work, and they know what sucks, and they know what the fans aren't appreciating. Maybe that gives them cause to make better choices moving forward. Because then the next thing is like, oh, Kevin, we want you to be Vinny Vegas. Or, hey, you got a phone call from Rick Steiner. He's telling you that Shawn Michaels wants you to be his bodyguard, and Kevin Nash jumps at that. Maybe for some of these wrestlers, with anybody in life, if you know situations that are horrible and are embarrassing and are career stifling, you go through that anguish and that degradation, and then hey, I'm going to do something better. And with Kevin Nash, Vinny Vegas was an improvement. And obviously Diesel was an improvement. And Diesel 95, like the Survivor Series Diesel, was a big improvement. And then when he had the big money offer to come back to just be Kevin Nash, isn't it funny that after all these gimmicks, the Master Blaster tag team, Oz, Vinny Vegas, Diesel, Hardcore Diesel, but the one that really people like the most is NWO Kevin Nash. So it's just kind of interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like they say, the best gimmicks are just you turned up to 11. I mean, all the years of success, and his best character was literally just him being him.
Yeah.
But moving
on, to a certain extent,
go ahead.
It's going to be the card. It's going to be the card that he's dealt too. I mean, he's not an on top star at that time. He's working his way up. He sees the things that's going on. He sees that Herd just fired the biggest guy in the company 2 weeks earlier. You know what I mean? So I think some of these guys might have been in the position too. This is what I got to do right now. This is what I got to go through. You know what I mean? And if I want a job, this is what it's got to be. And, I think you got to factor that into it as well. Because there was a lot of great workers with a lot of crappy gimmicks in that 2 year span.
I think you guys are really onto something here. It's like one of these things where, you're given a job to do, and you can either bitch and not do it, or you can kind of, bitch to yourself and do it. But, Kevin Nash maybe bitched to himself, but he did it. And I think the fact that he went through the Oz and the Master Blaster and the Vinny Vegas made him more appealing to Vince McMahon, because like this guy, he's a team player. He does what he's told. He does what's best for business. So maybe ultimately, like Mike said, it really helped him in the long run.
Yeah, actually, that's good you say that. Speaking of playing ball, the next match had what was I personally believe was, in my opinion, was the best match of the night, just because these two knew each other so well. I even liked the story, was Robert Gibson against Richard Morton. Now, I said Richard Morton, not Ricky Morton. This is a guy who, even today, is still active, still just a draw for the conventions and the fans, still has the prettiest mullet in the business. Somebody made the conscious decision to turn Ricky Morton heel. Robert Gibson had been injured, so Ricky Morton had kind of been going at it as a singles competitor. Hadn't had the best luck as a singles competitor. Ended up turning on excuse me, Robert Gibson when he came back, siding with Alexandra York. Of course, she became everyone, for the most part, that's the future Terry Runnels. But interestingly enough, and I want to get to gimmicks for a second, is her persona, this York Foundation. She had the big laptop, tablet, computer, whatever you want to call it. And the computer would analyze talents. That was the storyline. They could analyze your opponents, and by using the computer, program or figure out the way to beat them. Now, obviously, in the 21st century, we know that's not how computers work. But back then, the personal computer was still a relatively new concept. And how many cartoons or TV shows did one floppy disk have the virus or codes you needed to save the world or destroy it? The computers had this almost cartoony superpower, and I think it fit perfectly. And as a huge fan of the Rock and Roll Express, if either of them was to have a successful run as a heel, I think Ricky Morton is the right call. Just because he's, no offense to the man, still a huge fan, but he could work circles around Robert Gibson in most cases. So he kind of had that persona. But these guys, there was a spot in the match which I talk about the story. Richard Morton kept rolling out of the ring, powdering out, and he would consult. They'd check the computer. I almost wonder if the microphones were better, like what they were talking about, But he kept going back and forth. But there was a spot where they kind of both ended up on the ramp, because this was back, if you remember, when the ramp was at ring level, and they did a matching drop kick, and they both just kind of kicked each other's feet, and it was just so smooth. Where, if I can get off topic for just a second, I'm very critical of some of the current wrestling today, because it looks very worked. It's almost like a
choreographed.
Thank you, choreographed. It reminds me more of a stage, like a fight show you'd see at an amusement park, a stunt show, than a fight. These guys clearly went over this ahead of time. They worked together. They were talking, but it never looked overly choreographed. It looked good. It looked fun. The match ended with typical heel fashion. There was a distraction. Richard Morton hit Robert Gibson with the computer. 1, 2, 3. Match went about 15 minutes or so. It was one of the longer matches of the night. But really, this was like Mikey said. Not everything about this show was bad. The crowd was into this. I thought it was great. But Mikey, you were kind of looking for the positive here, and this is truly a positive of the night. What do you think?
It was positive, and the funny thing is, Dan, I was always a very anti-Rock and Roll Express young fan. Like I had signs that had, like, I would cut out the heads of a Rock and Roll Express tag team poster, and I had one for Ricky Morton, and I had it taped, and the sign read wanted, like a wanted sign. It said wanted, then Ricky's face for being a sissy. So that was my Ricky Morton sign. And then the Robert Gibson one, I took the Robert Gibson, same thing, cut his head out and put it on a sign and on the poster board. And I put a bandage over his lips, like a bandage over his mouth, like a real bandage on the poster of Robert Gibson's mouth. And I wrote, "Poor Robert, semicolon, has no tongue." And I brought these things to the Baltimore Arena for a match they had against Tully and Arn. And trust me, I was getting heat from the young girls in the audience. They didn't appreciate this. So that was the type of fan that I was. So I was very anti-Rock and Roll Express. At the time, they were something, you could say equivalent for today's young fan, like a babyface Young Bucks or something like that, or Rockers. for the WWF fans a generation later or half a generation later. To me, oddly enough, at the time, I thought this match was kind of sad because, like, it was kind of the end of an era. Like, you're really getting it home. Like, okay, Dusty's at this show, but he's doing commentary. Flair's not here. Tully and Arn are gone. And, Tully's gone. Arn's here with no Tully. The Horsemen are kind of broken up because Flair's gone. And then you've got the Rock and Roll Express with one guy really beating the crap out of the other guy, trying to dislocate his knee. I thought the heel work by Morton tearing up that knee and literally ripping Gibson's tights was pretty dastardly heel work. So I think you're right. Ricky had the charisma to be a heel. But in a way, it's a well-executed match, but it's almost like a match that makes you feel bad because it's like these two guys should be together. It was good that they broke apart for a while. Even the Freebirds broke apart for a while in Georgia in '81. But this was just kind of a tough match to watch. Hey guys, I just have to you guys keep talking. I have to let this dog out. The dog's very excited, so I'll be right back in a minute.
No worries. Actually, that's a great segue. Jim and Benny, I'm going to throw this one to you, but the next match was a 6-man elimination match with the Freebirds. This was Jimmy Garvin and Michael Hayes with Bad Street, who was under the mask, and that was Brad James, and I think was the name he was wrestling at before, but Brad Armstrong with the infamous Big Daddy Dink, who we knew as Oliver Humperdinck from the WWF, against the Young Pistols, Tracy Smothers and Steve Armstrong, which as a fan, I'll admit, in '91, I didn't realize there were siblings wrestling against each other, and Dustin Rhodes. Now, Mikey, I want to lead into that because Mikey said Dusty was on commentary. One of the backstage notes from this show, and this match is where I think it's most important, is Dusty was also the head booker at the time. So you have his son in this match in a 6-man elimination. But Jim, Benny, I'm going to bounce this to you guys. Walk us through this match, which I think was another good one. So one of the back-to-back good matches here.
I'll let the guests go first.
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, for me with the Freebirds, I'm always going to be a traditionalist. I always like the Buddy Roberts, Bam Bam, and Michael Hayes Freebirds. I wasn't a big fan of the Jimmy Garvin Freebird. Brad Armstrong worked his ass off under the mask. He was bouncing all over the place. It was really good.
Denny?
Well, first of all, I have to take a page out of today's wrestler and get my shit in about the previous match. So I wanted to make 2 quick observations about the Ricky Morton and Gibson match. One is that, I really thought Ricky did a good job as a heel, but the one thing I thought was bad was he really didn't do anything to differentiate himself from the babyface Ricky Morton. He came out wearing the Rock and Roll Express T-shirt. He still had the mullet. Why do you do that if you want to separate yourself from Robert Gibson? You're wearing the same stuff as he did. And the other thing was he spent a good part of 15 minutes working on Gibson's leg, which was great heel work. But then he won the match by hitting him over the head with the Wang word processor or whatever else, whatever that was he had. Why didn't he just bash him on the knee with it and make him tap out or something like that? So I just thought that the ending didn't really match the whole psychology of the match. But getting back to this match, my observation was this was the beginning of the Dustin Rhodes push, because number one, you had that interview backstage, and I'm echoing here. You had Dustin Rhodes backstage, and he sounded just like Dusty, purposely, I'm sure. Yeah, it really sounded just like Dusty. And then during the match, Dustin carried the match. He did the last 2 eliminations, and then he shows up in another match as one of the Lumberjacks. And he figures in the finish of that match. So I think there was a little bit too much Dustin Rhodes in this match, on this card, I guess.
Yeah, I could see that. Actually, Benny, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Dustin Rhodes had all 3 eliminations? Because both the Young Pistols were eliminated by 2 different combinations of double DDTs. And then Dustin Rhodes had the roll up, and then he fought out with the 2-on-1.
I think one of them was Michael Hayes got DQ'd for throwing somebody over the top rope. I thought that was one of the eliminations.
Yeah, you know what? You're right. You're right. I was thinking that because it was of the spot. Yeah, the old top rope rule.
But then he got the other two for sure.
Correct. Yeah. So I mean, he was maybe. Yeah, you're right. I was thinking he got every elimination, but he did. He just got the two that were actually pinned. But this match, I mean, really, it told a good story, and like you said, it was really the maybe the next generation onward. You saw that with Rocky Maivia, his debut at Survivor Series. Mikey mentioned Diesel at the Survivor Series. Multi-man elimination matches have always been a good way of pushing somebody. And this was really the intro of, hey, Dustin Rhodes, who unfortunately would not last nearly as long in WCW as he could have, getting fired along with Bunkhouse Buck after they both bladed in that King of the Road match. But this was really a push. And I think, Benny, the reason I wanted to mention Dusty being the booker is I didn't think about it as a fan, as a kid, but watching it as an adult, knowing that you can get, you can still look good without being a superhero. And Dustin Rhodes, he was booked super strong, and Daddy took care of him on this night. But even without that, this was still a great match. I think you had it. Mikey, you have any thoughts here?
It was actually Blacktop Bully that you're thinking of in Uncensored 95.
What did I say?
You said Bunkhouse Buck.
You're right. I'm sorry. Blacktop Bully. Yeah, the Repo Man.
Right. Crusher Darsaw, Barry Darsaw. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that four grown men are correcting each other on Blacktop Bully versus Bunkhouse Buck? and there's other grown men that are listening to this. But in any event, I thought it was a good 6-man elimination. But once again, not to do the whole overview thing, but really, if you look at the balance of this card, it's only halfway through the show. We've had a scaffold match. We've had a 6-man elimination match. It's just gimmick after gimmick, and there's more to come. And I think that it's kind of like that TNA show, 6 Sides of Steel, Lockdown, the yearly pay-per-view, or even Hell in the Cell for WWE fans. It's when you have too many gimmick matches on one show, then it takes away the power of just 1 or 2 gimmick matches.
Right.
And Bischoff makes that point, to give him credit. He makes that point a lot on his podcast at A3 Weeks, but I'm making that point here as well. It really becomes clear, and no offense to Jim Herd, at Oz, actually, Kevin Nash blames the whole Oz thing on Dusty. If you ever seen the Kevin Nash shoot, he blames Dusty for the Oz thing. But it really is like a person who's not a wrestling fan, but just knows enough to throw all this crap at the wall. And it's interesting that Armstrong wrestled his brother in this. Brad Armstrong and Scott Armstrong. Is it Scott or Steve? Steve Armstrong, as one of the Young Pistols. It's kind of interesting that you have an Armstrong versus Armstrong, which doesn't really get talked about a whole lot.
Well, it's important to note too that after you had the elimination, he was out both ways. He rescued. You saw Brad Armstrong as Brad Armstrong in the night, and as Bad Street earlier in the evening. So, it was kind of the whammy there. Now, this next match, I want to kind of gloss over because of the crowd. But the next match was the Yellow Dog, who we talked about earlier. That was Brian Pillman. He had lost a Loser Leaves Town match. Now, everybody knew the Yellow Dog was Brian Pillman. As a matter of fact, Mikey, you mentioned that Jim Ross calls him Flying Brian at some point during the match. But the problem, and the reason, like I said, I want to gloss over it, is this was still, yes, Baltimore isn't exactly the South, but this was still your typical NWA Southern wrestling crowd. Johnny B. Bad at the time was not a gimmick that they had embraced yet. He would eventually become very popular. But Brian Pillman led the crowd in some really awful chants directed at Johnny B. Bad. I don't know if the network edited them out or Peacock edited them out, but it was yes. They did. Okay. Yeah. But they were chanting some homophobic slurs, among other things. And now, interestingly enough, before we move on, by the way, Brian Pillman won by disqualification. Again, Theodore Long, another manager. Johnny B. Bad had just 2 weeks previously to debuting as Johnny B. Bad, lost a squash jobber match as Mark Marrow. So for anybody paying attention, this was another, holy crap, that's the guy I just saw last week. But yeah, it was rough. Me personally, maybe that's what I get for watching an old DVD instead of the Peacock. But yeah, I thought this was rough to get through. Now the next match.
Well, can we examine this match? Jeez, we can't gloss over the Yellow Dog, can we?
I mean, we could talk about the Yellow Dog. I'd rather not talk about the. I mean, I guess we can, as long as we don't touch too much on the crowd. It's just the crowd reaction really soured this match for me.
Well,
but
okay,
go ahead, Mikey.
Well, it's interesting that Pillman as the Yellow Dog, it's actually edited out of the Peacock network, because I know the stuff you're talking about. There's also a moment where Pillman looks in the mask. It's a very weird camera angle. Pillman and like Johnny B. Bad, who are about to wrestle each other, are almost standing at the ropes together, almost like a tag team, with like 3 feet apart from them. They're about to wrestle each other. And Johnny B. Bad and Teddy Long are kind of playing goo-goo face to the camera. And then the camera pans to Pillman as the Yellow Dog, and he says a homosexual insult, Johnny B. Homosexual insult. And when that happens on the Peacock network, they black the screen out, and it says, due to technical considerations with the original tape, this show is being formatted the best possible way. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's the time when Pillman said
they blamed it on a technical issue.
They blamed it on a technical issue.
That was actually up for quite a bit of time, though, wasn't it, Mike?
Well, it might have been on the WWE network, but on the Peacock.
I'm saying that like on Peacock, that description was up there for quite a bit of time.
But by the time I got to it, it was on for about 5 or 6 seconds. So, because it was like Pillman says this straight to camera, and Pillman was a rough guy around the edges. You know what I mean? I mean, there's all these backstage stories about Pillman being rough around the edges, but I thought he was a great on-screen character. But the point is, it was a different time. It's not to excuse the behavior, but it was just a culture. I mean, there's a game where Christian Laettner in college basketball is getting chanted at by the fans in a similar way. It wasn't just wrestling fans in Baltimore, is my point.
No, it wasn't. I was just saying that you wouldn't, if you think about the raw animosity from the NWA crowds, you wouldn't get those kind of chants today. Maybe some parts of the country still, but not you go to a typical AEW, WWE indie show, you're not going to, maybe, I don't know, maybe
Sonny
GCW,
Kiss,
maybe. Yeah.
Well, Sonny Kiss is one of the most popular guys in AEW, right? When he wrestles, and it's flamboyancy, and it's out and proud and everything. Anyway, to get off the topic, as far as I did want to say, if there's this is how things in wrestling can sometimes get forgotten about. The Yellow Dog was kind of a cool thing, because Brian Pillman is actually mocking Barry Windham, because Barry Windham had wrestled as the Dirty Yellow Dog in Florida Championship Wrestling when he got humiliated by Ron Bass. Ron Bass put a saddle on his back and rode him around the ring in front of Gordon Soley and all of Florida Championship Wrestling. And so Barry Windham didn't even lose a loser leave town match. He was just humiliated, and he came back as this Dirty Yellow Dog character, and he had a chain. So that was going back to like 83, right? Now you flash forward to 91, and because Dusty Rhodes remembers all this stuff, and he was there for Florida, and he's there for this, they're trying to reinvent that, like they did with the Midnight Rider. And what it was that Brian Pillman and Elegante lost a loser of the fall leaves town match to Arn and Barry at a Clash of Champions in May of 91. So when Pillman loses the fall and he leaves the WCW and he comes back as Yellow Dog, it's a direct reference to Dirty Yellow Dog. All that's great. The thing is, those fans of WCW, NWA didn't really know everything that I just said, unless they were also fans of Florida.
Right.
And they were not refreshed with this memory. It was never presented. They never showed old clips of Florida. They never even brought it up. So it's like, unless you're a Pro Wrestling Illustrated fan from 83 who stuck around until 91, you have no idea of this storyline and the significance.
Yeah, well, you see that in the Ted DiBiase's manservant character was named Virgil specifically as a jab, and how many people knew whose real name that was.
Sure. Right. It's inside stuff for inside stuff. I guess my disappointment, guys, is that, like I said, the yellow dog Brian Pillman thing became a defunct or a what's the term for a president who's no longer got power? Dead goose? Or something? What's it called? Not deposed, like a sitting duck?
Sitting duck.
Lame duck.
Lame duck.
Yeah.
It became a lame duck angle because Windham's in this mask. It's all about feuding with Barry Windham. And Barry Windham, an hour and a half later, is turning babyface by default. So my point is, sometimes it's almost like in pro wrestling, you need a continuity expert. Hey guys, before we change Barry into a babyface, let's have him and the Yellow Dog have some type of conclusion. Where, like, if Yellow Dog beats Windham on this Saturday morning show, Brian Pillman gets to come back as Brian Pillman. Just something. And I think that's the frustration of pro wrestling fans like myself, is when you don't tie up loose ends, it makes you feel like this storyline didn't count for anything. Why did I invest my time in caring about this storyline if you didn't tie up the loose end? And why should I care about the future storylines? If you're not going to tie up your storylines, whether it be WCW in 1991 or WWE in 2021, why should we as fans keep on investing in your product, in your storylines, if you don't deliver a beginning, middle, and end? That's right. It. That's all. I'm done now.
Had to throw that in there, didn't you?
Well, I'm trying to show that what I think happens, Dan and Benny and our friend here, is that sometimes the wrestling powers that be, the fans, the promoters, the wrestlers, they think that stuff doesn't matter and it doesn't count. But my opinion is, if you're going to put the hassle of putting this stuff on television and expecting people to watch it, it has to count. It has to count for something. Otherwise, what are we all doing here? So make it work.
Yeah. I can see that. Where were we? Moving on. Actually, this next match, Benny, you kind of already talked about Big Josh and Black Blood, another manager moment with Kevin Sullivan in a lumberjack match. This is really, to kind of get some time back, this is really a nothing match. Dusty interfered. The lumberjacks were awful in that they spent the entire match just fighting each other on the outside. Yeah. This really, I mean, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong here, because you've touched on it in some of the articles. This was really a throwaway. Like, this match could have not existed and nothing would have changed storyline or pay-per-view wise.
It was a time filler, in my opinion. But yeah. Who was just a note of interest? Who was the Black Blood? Was that
Billy Jack Haynes?
Was that Billy Jack Haynes? Yeah,
yes, that was Billy Jack Haynes. Yeah,
I thought so. Yeah, I thought so.
And
I just wanted
of
to make
course,
sure.
Big Josh was Matt Bourne, who would go on to become the original Doink. So
actually, a great feud from Portland from back in the day.
Yeah, no, you're right. But following that spectacle of a match, which really, when you have a lumberjack match that's only 5 minutes, it's filler. It's not meant to be anything big. Moving on, though, to a match that was also about 5 minutes, which is about 5 minutes too long. You had One Man Gang against Elegante, the soon-to-be Giant Gonzalez. Now, this match comes from the previous pay-per-view, Super Brawl, where Elegante defeated Sid Vicious in his go-away match, or I guess go-home match, but his last match in WCW, and One Man Gang interfered at the end, and it led to some brawling there. But this was, we've talked about Haas matches. Benny, you know how much I love the big Haas fight. This was two big guys fighting. Unfortunately, this was two big guys who can't fight. One Man Gang was already on the down, and Elegante was pretty much immobile and just terrible around the board. Jim, I'm going to give you this one. What are your thoughts on this 5-minute spectacle?
Well, the entry with Kevin Sullivan was looking 9 kinds of crazy. If y'all paid attention to that at all, it was the whole thing. It was just over the top from the beginning. Elegante comes out with the 3 or 4 midgets in tow. You know what I mean? So, yeah, and the one-man gang, I'm not sure what incarnation of the one-man gang we got with that character, but it was nothing like any one-man gang we had seen previously. It was laughable all the way around, and I did several times.
Yeah. And Elegante did end up winning with, I'm not 100% sure what that was supposed to be, but he had, go ahead, Benny.
A very poor reverse clothesline, I guess is.
Yeah, I'm not sure what he was going for. Almost looked like a botch, but so does everything else he did. But
I did like that Kevin Sullivan invoked Abu Dean, reminiscent of the Florida. I really liked
his old
that.
Florida.
Yeah.
And keep Florida in mind, because we're going to talk about it here in a minute. But the next match, and Benny, I'm going to throw this one to you. This was Nikita Koloff against Sting in a Russian chain match. We've seen chains, bull ropes, but this match was the touch the four corners, and this was one of the hotter feuds going at the time. I'm going to give this one to you. What are your thoughts on this match, which was another highlight of the evening?
I liked it. I mean, I thought it was a pretty good match. I mean, I'm a huge fan of both of these guys. Two of my favorites from the mid to late 80s. Nikita gets the Duke, but I don't think the loss hurt Sting because he wasn't pinned. And it was one of those things where that last corner he beat him by a millisecond, so enough to get Nikita the win, but not really enough to throw any kind of negative hurt on Sting. But I mean, I thought it was an entertaining match. Like I said, two of my favorites from back in the mid to late 80s.
Yeah, and Sting did get his heat back pretty quickly, beating Nikita up with the chain.
The chain wedgie at the end.
Exactly. I want to invoke, Mikey, you talk about what's old is new again. I didn't even put the connection together until I watched this again, leading up to this show. This is the almost exact same match and ending as the Texas Bull Rope match between JBL and Eddie Guerrero, where JBL won the title. Eddie tried to jump over him, ended up pushing him into the corner. It was almost shot for shot, the four corners, the chain. It was almost shot for shot the same match. However, I want to talk one difference is in the bull rope match, I was probably about 12 feet. I would say there was a pretty good chunk of rope, and you had moments where Eddie was able to do his stuff and JBL was able to do his stuff with the power. In this match, it seemed like the chain was way too short for what they were trying to do. And both a testament to their professionalism, because they still pulled off a great match. But there were definitely spots and moments where, especially in Sting's case, where it seemed like the chain handicapped them. What do you think?
I think you're probably right. And I think of a photograph I saw in an old wrestling magazine of Michael Hayes and Kerry Von Erich literally having a handcuff match. Can you imagine that? The guys are handcuffed by the wrist. Like they're handcuffed to each other, Hayes and Kerry. So that was probably even a worse match. And I don't think that's on tape anywhere. I think you got a good point. I wanted to say real quick about those other matches. To me, couldn't a Billy Jack Haynes versus Matt Bourne match? That would be a good match for a pay-per-view.
That's a great match.
Yeah.
Right. And once again, it's not to crucify him but Jim Herd it's too much stuff. The Elegante thing I wanted to say for a second, because it was almost a Mandela effect for me, if people are familiar with that term, when memories don't match up. I've watched this show several times before, and I could not remember the little people coming in with Elegante. When I was watching this show 3 weeks ago to prep for this podcast, and here comes Elegante with these four little people, I was kind of freaking out, because I'm like, I don't remember this happening at all. What's going on here? It's, you know what I mean? Like, my memory is getting just changed, and that's a hashtag Mandela effect, which I have some videos on. Subscribe to Mike Messier YouTube channel, but you can find Mandela effect everywhere people talk about it.
That's got to be a new one. Hey, Mikey just plugged his YouTube page for conspiracy videos while talking about an Elegante wrestling match from 1991. That has got to be a new record there.
Well, I mean, I could have mentioned my book and put it in front of the camera, but I didn't bother to do that. But anyway, I felt like One Man Gang. I think Jim made a great point. a really bad incarnation. And I think that's sometimes what WCW did back then, was they would get these old WWF guys and they would try to fluff them up a little bit. And a lot of times it didn't work. Sometimes with, for instance, Ricky Steamboat, it did work because Steamboat was such a good wrestler. But a guy like Hacksaw Jim Duggan coming in, or even the Blacktop Bully, the former member of Demolition, who of course was Crusher Khrushchev, it's just like sometimes they were just trying to fluff up these old WWF guys and do something different with them. And for fans like myself, it felt empty. Going back to this match you just talked about, what match are we on? I'm getting so excited.
We were just talking about Nikita Koloff and Sting in the chain match.
Well, you know what? Just to make it quick, a great match. You're right, Benny. Sting didn't lose anything. It was unusual to see a babyface kind of lose a feud, so to speak, at this time. Although this did set us up for Sting and Nikita reuniting, 6 or 7 months later as babyfaces, because the fans really did like Nikita. And Nikita's talked about this time when he was brought in as a heel to fight Luger and then Sting. And he said when he was fighting Luger, it was like, 50-50, the fans were cheering for Luger and cheering for him as the heel Nikita. And then when he fought Sting, it was like 60 to 70% for Sting, but like 30 or 40% for him as Nikita as this heel. The fans wanted Nikita as a babyface because the initial turn with Magnum TA back in '86 was so powerful, the fans never could be retrained to hate Nikita after that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And it's funny you mentioned the recycling, because that was a point of what would become the later Monday Night Wars, where you saw Earthquake become Avalanche and the Big Boss Man become the Big Boss and the Guardian, where you brought somebody over and it was a watered down version, and then maybe they jump back to WWF as themselves, and you saw that with the Big Boss Man with the corporation, and then his later as Booker T's henchman, where every time they recycle the gimmick, it's a weaker, worse version, and it just never recaptures that magic. But moving on to what was on the poster, should have been the main event, but it did not go on last, was the Lex Luger Barry Windham cage match. Jim, I'm going to throw this one to you, but it's important to note that this match was changed. We talked about it at the top of the hour. This match was changed. It was supposed to be Luger and Flair, with Flair leaving, Jim Herd having to come out and announcing that Barry Windham was going to be the replacement, and Mikey touched on his turn as the match went on. But I'm going to give this to you, and then Mikey, I want you to touch on the face turn. But Jim, what were your thoughts on this cage match, which, my opinion, really, because it started as Flair Luger, when it was Flair Windham, there was no heat. It almost felt, as a fan, even as a kid, I'm like, I didn't get why it was in a cage. But what do you think, Jim?
Well, it was a last-minute audible by Dusty. You know what I mean? He was doing what he had to do to put the best person in there to get the best he could out of a world championship match. So going with Windham, I mean, it seems like the obvious choice to me. But, yeah, you're right. There was no emotional build-up to the story for that at all. It was just let's run with what we know is going to work. Because, at the end of the day, Windham is such a clean worker that you could put him in any of them situations and he's going to make it go and get something out of it. You know what I mean? So I think it was just a situation of, like, what are we going to do? You know what I'm saying? And they made the right choice, I think.
Absolutely. Benny, you touched on Florida earlier when you talked about Kevin Sullivan. Something else that came from Florida was the title belt in this match. It was the Florida Championship Wrestling from Florida belt with some plates loosely attached to it. As any fan of the territories, it was a very recognizable belt design. And I was surprised watching it back that they didn't really make much effort to hide the fact that it wasn't a WCW belt. It was prominently featured. Ref lifted it up. Camera showed it. What do you think about the audible for the belt?
Yeah, I'm not really sure how much people caught on. I mean, I think, people like us, the true aficionados, we catch on to stuff like that. I think most people probably miss that. I just think with this whole match, again, the same thing. You got great ingredients, but there's no chef. I mean, again, two of my favorite guys, but when you're expecting Ric Flair, no matter what, it's a come down when he's not there.
And Benny, you touched on it, or excuse me, Mikey, you touched on it. I'll give you the 2 points. The crowd clearly wanting Ric Flair, and then you mentioned earlier Barry Windham turning face by default. Walk us through what you were thinking with how this match ended with Luger.
It was as a young fan watching this thing, it was very confusing. And Jim Ross, and I believe Jim Ross has said, so I want to give him credit, that he actually passed. He passed something like a liver stone or something.
A kidney stone. Yeah.
So Jim Ross has said that during this show, he's passing a kidney stone, and you can't really tell in the commentary. So I just have to tip my hat to Jim Ross for that, because that's real professionalism.
It's kind of like blowing out a quad,
Right. And I do want to say that this was also a pay-per-view, by my memory, that was Tony Schiavone's first show back on pay-per-view with the NWA, WCW. I could be wrong, but I think it was the reunion of Ross and Schiavone as a commentary team. So I like that as a fan, like those voices together. And here we are in 2021, and those guys are working together again. Okay, let's go to this match. The match is weird. It has a weird energy. When Barry comes to the ring, they've misspelled his name on the graphic, which always upset me. They did, and it's insult to me. That's an insult to the performer. And as Jim said, what a performer Barry Windham is and was. Also, I want to give credit at the beginning of this pay-per-view. A shining part of this pay-per-view is the opening, where they from the point of view of the cameraman, getting two free tickets to the show and then going into the Baltimore Arena. That's kind of a nice thing that you haven't seen before or since. It might be the highlight of the whole show. It's actually kind of
It was cool. Yeah, it was cool.
Yeah.
I like that you said they were free, because even as a kid, I noticed that he didn't pay for the tickets.
Yeah, there's no money
said,
involved.
Two tickets, please, and the guy threw tickets at him, and go to your seats there.
So, I mean, having been to the Baltimore Arena as a wrestling fan many times, and I would really like to go back, to be honest with you, seeing the 90s fashion of kind of the fanny packs and the T-shirts and all that stuff, that kind of gives me good emotions, to be honest with you, because you feel like you're there. You know what I mean? Now, this match, Windham comes out, and I believe it's Jim Ross who says something to the effect of, and he has his contingency of fans here, plenty of Barry Windham fans here, which was really kind of like, what's that all about? You know what I mean? Because why would you say that? Wyndham's supposed to be the heel. They do the whole match, and then halfway through, or 9/10 of the way through, here comes Mr. Hughes and Harley Race. And Mr. Hughes was supposed to be the heater for the York Foundation at that time, but he's here with Harley Race, and Harley Race wasn't doing anything on camera at the time that I can remember. So it was very interesting. And then what does Harley say to Luger? Now is the time. And I believe it was just like Curtis Hughes was yelling at Windham or somehow distracting him. Didn't really touch him because it's a cage match. And Luger just gets like kind of energized up and gets this pile driver on Windham. It kind of feels like a clean finish. Like it's like if Harley and Mr. Hughes were supposed to be heels and helping Luger cheat, where is the cheating? Unless you want to say that Curtis Hughes distracting Barry is somehow this giant cheat. Okay, I think that was lost on the live audience, because the live audience is kind of cheering for Luger, maybe because they feel like they have to. This is kind of a crappy way for Luger to get his first world title. It would have been crappy for Barry to get the title here too. I think one thing that I'm not sure we touched upon is that there is this other story that goes around the internet, and I think Flair and Windham have talked about it. At one point, they wanted Ric Flair to lose the title to Barry before the pay-per-view on a Saturday night taping. Like they wanted to shoehorn in, okay, Flair, you're leaving the territory. We're not re-signing you. We can't agree. Do the favors to Barry Windham, heel versus heel, on the way out. And then Barry will then either keep the title over Luger at the Bash and maybe do a chase, Luger chasing Windham, or the same title flip at the Bash, Luger beating Windham. And maybe they'd squeeze in that Harley Race stuff at the Bash with that. But Windham, there was a plan. What I'm saying is there was a plan for an attempt to have Windham go into the Bash 1991 as the defending world champion. But that's when Rick said, I'm not going to even lose to Barry. And Barry, I believe, has said that he was kind of upset about that for a lot of years because he felt that, hey, Rick, I've been right with you since the get. We've been the Horsemen together. We had the Crockett Cup match together. Why can't you put me over for this title? That would mean a lot to me. But Rick was so disgusted with Hurd, he no longer cared about Windham. He was out.
Yeah, that was all about Hurd, not about Windham.
Exactly.
Right. The other thing,
his history shown that those two made amends eventually.
There was one other point I had to squeeze in there, Dan. It was about the Barry Windham in some regard. Just like Jim said, just a terrific wrestler. Oh, this is what it was. There was some history with these two. It goes back to the shot heard around the world. Barry Windham turning on Lex Luger back in April of '88, when Windham turned on Luger and broke up the tag team and basically put the belts on a silver platter to Tully and Arn before the Crockett Cup '88, after the Clash of Champions '88 and before the Crockett Cup. So Windham had turned on Luger 3.5 years earlier, but there was still friction because Luger and Windham were never on the same side. One was a baby face, one was a heel. One was a heel, one was a baby face. You know what I mean? So
Right.
like I said, this is my sweet spot as a fan. Me seeing these two guys put into a cage for a vacant title, that's not so bad for a young Mike Messier at the time. Like, I can go for that. It wasn't cold to me because I knew the history. Did WCW do a good job of presenting that history to salivate the fans to make up for Ric Flair not being there? Probably not, because Jim Hurd probably knew less about pro wrestling than a 5-year-old Mike Messier at the time.
Well, moving on, again, you have, like you said, what is the big moment leading up with the default double turn. Now you've got Luger as the champion with the Florida belt. That's where you end the spectacle. However, it was not the last match of the night, because we still have one match left. Now, I'm going to get into a little story for this one because it's very interesting. Benny and I were talking about this yesterday, or was it this morning before the match? And Benny, you were unaware of this little tidbit, so I'll tell you guys the story as well, the listeners out there. The match was supposed to be the Steiner brothers, and it was supposed to be the Steiner brothers and Missy Hyatt against the Arn Anderson, Barry Windham, and Paulie Dangerously, who would, of course, go on to be Paul Heyman. However, when Barry Windham got pulled from the match to be in the cage, it became a handicap match. They pulled Scott Steiner, so you had Rick Steiner and Missy Hyatt against Arn Anderson and Paulie Dangerously. However, the story goes that but I don't know if it was during the event or right before, but the Maryland Athletic Commission had a law in place that did not allow intergender competition. So going into the night, at some point during the pay-per-view, they find out Missy Hyatt can't be in this match because men aren't allowed to put their hands on her. So they had the bit before the match started where some guys came out and abducted her and carried her backstage. So it was Rick Steiner in the handicap match against Arn Anderson and Paulie Dangerously, which this match was, I don't know if it was a side effect of having to change it at the last minute again, but from bell to bell, this match was 2 minutes and 8 seconds, and Rick Steiner was successful. Paulie Dangerously proving that maybe managers should stay managers. I take nothing away from his effort, but it was obvious he's not a wrestler. It goes to what Mikey was saying with people, where the wrestlers care, but it's just the crap they're dealt with. In this particular match, you could tell Arn and Rick were doing what they could, but I got to look at my watch. We've got to end this thing in about 2 or 3 minutes. This is a throwaway match. They both knew it. They wrestled well, but they clearly weren't 100% because I'm not going to risk injuring myself over this garbage. And the crowd really wasn't into it and went home more confused than happy or angry because how is this the end of the night? But this was really this match and just some of the stuff in between is kind of the sticking point of why everything is so negative. But Jim, what were your thoughts on this, the final 2 minutes of the show?
I really think that they could have worked Scott Steiner back in once they knew that Missy Hyatt was going to be taken out over the athletic commission, which the state's athletic commission, they're more harm than good sometimes when it comes to the quality of the product. But they could have had Scott come down and they could have worked some kind of an angle to at least pull something out of the match where it wasn't just a 2-minute blow off. You know, it wouldn't have been a great match and you would have had Paulie and Arn versus the Steiners, but it wouldn't have been this crappy little blow away handicap job.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, this pay-per-view just kind of fell apart and we had some ups and downs. I'm going to go around the room. I'll start with final grades. If I was being nice because of some of the highlights, I'd give this show a D+. Benny, what do you think?
C-. I mean, there was some good. There was a lot of good. And like Mike said, these guys really tried. They did the best they could with what they had.
Mikey, what do you think?
At the time I watched it, I would probably give it a D, and I probably give it a D+ now. Just for the record, Scott Steiner was injured, and he wouldn't come back for months. So sure, you could have had him come out and just be Scott Steiner and never get tagged in, but I guess they took injuries pretty seriously back then, or maybe he was milking an injury. Who knows? But the other thing I wanted to switch in is a cheap plug, but as Benny knows, I did a video where I did revisionist history, and I rebooked this whole show as an 8-man tournament. And my vision of this show is scrap the whole card and have an 8-man single night elimination tournament. And I believe I had Luger versus Arn in the first round. I had Nikita versus Sting in the first round, Morton versus Gibson in the first round, and I think Windham versus the Yellow Dog in the first round to put a button on that feud and still get you to where you needed to be with Luger versus Windham. So, I mean, I think the problem is with these wrestling promoters, once they've kind of locked in that this is our card, and oh my God, Flair's not here, what are we going to do? And like I think Jim said, Barry Windham's the most talented guy. Let's yank him out of this tag team thing because Scott's not there anyway. That's like the quick fix. It would have taken them a little more effort and a little more time to say, well, this whole show is pretty whacked out. Let's simplify it. Let's make it an 8-man tournament. Let's find a new champion. The crowd, if they're watching a title tournament and the guys are really working hard, they're probably going to stop chanting, "We want Flair" by the second or third match of the tournament, you know, because they're paying their money to be there. So they can't, they're hurting themselves if they're going to chant, "We want Flair" all night.
No,
that's my,
oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were done, Mikey. Go ahead.
No, that's just my vision of if I had been the booker at age 5 in Baltimore and Gary Michael Capetta and I and Dusty were sitting there at Sabatino's in Baltimore, you know, I would have broken out my pen and said, let's make this an 8-man tournament. And you can still have Luger win as a heel, and you can still turn Windham. You can still have Nikita versus Sting. You can still do all this cool stuff. But let's get rid of some of this scaffold stuff, 6-man eliminations, Big Josh, and we can get rid of all that crap and have a nice 8-man tournament that's 2 hours and 50 minutes and you're done with your pay-per-view. That's how I would see it.
Well, you know, you talk about winning over the crowd, which, by the way, Mikey, that was a good final thought for just give me a quick letter grade. I love it. But you mentioned winning over the crowd. Benny, when we talked about the last pay-per-view, the WWE pay-per-view, the Charlotte and Rhea Ripley match, the crowd was chanting, "We want Becky." And as the match went on, they turned and started really getting into it because of how good of a match it was. And they kind of won the crowd over. So it is possible. I don't know with the dedication the crowd had to the NWA crowd had to Flair, if how good of a match you'd have to do to win him over, but it is possible. But final thought, Jim, what was your grade on this show?
I would go along with Benny. I wouldn't drop it into the D range. I would give him a C minus, just because of the fact that you had a lot of guys that tried to get something out of what they were given, you know. So I wouldn't shit on it completely. You had a good cast of wrestlers.
I really do. I mean, getting back to Mikey for a second, I really like that, because I did watch his video about rebooking the Bash. And I mean, you think about it, like, you don't have the midgets, you don't have the Z-Hos and the Lumber Hos. And I'm not sure if they're the same ones. I mean, the ones that came out with Z-Man, are they the same ones that came out with Big Josh? I'm not sure. So you don't have that. You don't have, all the gimmicks. You don't have the cage. You just have 8 guys. And, I don't know, maybe somehow you can make it 10 if you had like a round robin or something like that.
Wild card round.
Yeah, get a wild card round. And I think with something like that, and you could just, say, we originally were going to do this, but however, due to the recent, dismissal, whatever you want to call it, of Ric Flair, we have now decided to make the championship contested by this tournament. I think people would have, really eaten that up.
Yeah, I could see that. And Mikey, I like that narrative. And if you have to, kind of like the other tournament pay-per-views, if you want to have maybe 1 or 2 of these matches that are passable, like, say, maybe a tag match, just no scaffold, but a straight tag match with Austin and Taylor against Eaton and somebody besides PN News, that could be the filler, or not, maybe not filler, you know what I mean? That could be the
Let
gap.
me up match. Yeah,
exactly, the gap between the tournaments. But I mean, really, so we got 4 of us, a couple of Marks, very knowledgeable in history, fans of wrestling for many years. Look at that.
It's Barry Windham with his championship. And he's
There you
so
go.
sad. He's so sad that he didn't leave Baltimore that night with the WCW title. He's oh no. Remco 85. Ah, boy.
But nothing like guys our age having action figure battles over webcam. But right, so we got 2 C minuses and 2 D pluses. Anybody that's ever been through school knows that still passes. So this show didn't fail.
That's a better GPA than anybody in the Animal House movie.
Yeah,
0.0.
Very true.
That's no grade point average.
But as we wrap up, guys, Mikey, Jim, I appreciate you being here. Jim, of course,
Absolutely.
Your work can be found on ProWrestlingStories.com. Mikey, you can be found on YouTube, the Join Mike Messier YouTube channel.
Subscribe to Mike Messier
Subscribe to Mike Messier, excuse me. Subscribe to Mike Messier.
Yep,
Go ahead.
Subscribe to Mike Messier YouTube channel. 906 subscribers. Thanks to yourself, and really thanks to Benny for always promoting and encouraging Mike's meals. For the wrestling fans, there's a lot of AEW clips on my channel you're not going to find anywhere else. That's just a hint. If you dig around, you're going to see some big-time AEW stuff that you're not going to find anywhere else. But subscribe to Mike Messier YouTube channel and all my Pro Wrestling Rants. You might disagree, you might agree, but stop by and see what you think.
There you go. And obviously, you guys both friends of the show, active on our page. We appreciate it. We like to grow and move off each other. And Benny, as we continue to go inward and outward, we got a lot of good things coming up for our channel and our show. And so for Mike Messier, for Jim Phillips, for the BS Express himself, Benny Scala, I'm Dan Spaciano. As always, everyone, have a great night and happy wrestling.